Ladies and gentlemen, we have a Carapace armor problem in Darktide. In this video, I'll be breaking down the problems as I see it with Carapace armor and its implementation in Darktide, as well as the implementation of the armor system in general. Whether or not you agree with me, if you enjoy this sort of analytical content and you like to learn more about Darktide's extremely strangely intricate systems, well, then you should definitely consider subscribing to the channel, and I really thank you guys for your support. Now, what you're currently viewing is a visual depiction of the enemy armor types in Darktide, along with their general distribution. And as a side note, if you're interested in looking into this for yourself, you can find it either under Steam Guides or in the description. It's called Enemy Types and Classifications, and it's by a user named Disposable Goon, which coincidentally was what kids called me in high school. So Darktide actually has a locational damage system that a lot of people don't appreciate enough. If you hit an enemy in a different location with a specific targeted weapon, reading that as not an AoE like an explosion or a flame effect, then you are going to deal location-based damage, and that can either increase or reduce the damage dealt. There are 6 armor types in Darktide currently: unarmored, flak armored, unyielding, maniac, carapace armored, and infested. And for a quick idea of how much damage each of these would do, you can look at the attack breakdowns on most weapons in the game, and you'll see a roughly similar pattern evolve. Unarmored enemies tend to take the most damage. Sometimes maniacs will come out a little bit ahead there. Both of these enemy types are very vulnerable to almost all damage dealt. Then we also have infested and unyielding that are somewhere in that high range because none of these enemies have any appreciable armor. The only time that armor starts to take an effect is here with flak armored enemies, and then finally we have carapace armored enemies as the massive outlier. On a gun like this double-barreled shotgun, it's about a 4 times reduction over the unarmored variant. And if we look at the braced auto gun from the intro here, we can see that it is a many times damage reduction. And this is a really big problem for Darktide. This system worked fairly well in Darktide's predecessor, Vermintide 2, because Vermintide 2 had more weapons that were capable of countering the armored threat. And additionally, the Vermintide 2 system was much more simple. Now, that's not to say that Vermintide's damage calculation system was perfect either. As you can tell by this spreadsheet here, the system of figuring out what enemies take how much damage from what attacks is also really complex behind the scenes in that game. But it is a far cry from how complex and, honestly, frustratingly obtuse the system in Darktide has gotten. A lot of this comes down to one really simple fact, which is that in Vermintide, the amount of armor types and the different amounts of armor types that individual enemies have is much less. For instance, we have only 4 base armor types in Vermintide 2: infantry, armored, berserkers, and monsters. In Darktide, as I mentioned a second ago, we now have 6 base armor types. What has happened is that between the 2 games, they have actually split up 2 of these categories into 2 of their own. So we have Maniac, which is the same as Berserkers from Vermintide 2. We have Unyielding, which is the same as Monsters from Vermintide 2. But then we have Infested and Unarmored that have been split off from that infantry armor type. And then we finally have Flak armor and Carapace armor that have been split off from the armored type. In Vermintide 2, we did also have this calculation for what's called super armor, and that applies to the Chaos Warriors, that game's equivalent of the Crusher. However, these enemies were still classed as armored for all purposes of calculation, and I think that was really simplifying the way that players could figure out and calibrate their weapons against those threats. What has happened in Darktide now is that instead of having only 4 perks that you can choose to place on your weapon that will tailor your weapon against certain enemy types, we now have 6. We have Carapace, Flak, Infested, Maniac, Unarmored, and Unyielding. And this is really complicated, and it further dilutes the pool and makes it even harder for players to understand what is actually going on. This is all multiplied even further when you look at how the enemies distribute the armor types across them. So in Vermintide 2, it was a rarity that any of these enemies had mixed armor types. In fact, the only ones that really did were the uppermost elites. So you had the Mauler equivalent that was literally called the Mauler in that game as well, and he also had a hardened head and a weak body, a relatively weak body, and that was a fine design. But what we've gotten into in this game is much more split armor types, and this is again further compounded by the damage taken on certain limbs and certain parts of enemies being modified again. So we have compounding upon compounding upon compounding complications to the system that make it really, really hard for players to understand when a shot is going to hurt or kill or what's going on at all. In fact, did you know that, for instance, the Dreg Gunners, the ones in yellow here, have two different armor types on their legs, and they'll take less damage on one leg than they would on the other. If you shoot them in this leg, they'll take an armored type damage. If you shoot them in the other, they'll take flak armored. Depending on what gun you have and its proficiency against those two, you might deal a wildly varying amount of damage. And then there's also these damage modifiers, this 0.5 there. That's representing that when you hit that target with a ranged attack, it's going to take 0.5 times that normal damage. So they take half as much damage to their extreme extremities and then 3/4 as much to their shoulders. And all of this stuff, and this just might be me, but let me know down in the comments, all this stuff to me is just wildly overcomplicated. For a game like Darktide, where this is a horde shooter and there are so many enemies in the field, I don't think that these systems really behoove players in any way, and I think that they tend to make the system way more involved and detailed than it needs to be. I think that we can have a really simple system where headshots make the enemies take additional damage, and body shots are a standardized damage, and we can go from there. We don't need to have this complicated system where extreme extremities take incredibly reduced damage, because these limbs might be coincidentally in the way of other hits. This is not a detailed combat simulator such as, I don't know, Mordhau or Half Sword. I don't think those are intending to be that, but those games have limb-based damage, right? This game is not that. And so I think that it would be a really, really simple ask to remove some of these modifiers. You could perhaps adjust the enemy's health to compensate for that. I don't think you would need to do that much, because how often are you hitting the Mauler in his hands and his feet? But that would greatly simplify it just to start. Then we need to look at the mixing of armor types like this, because this is further complicating the system. Now, we do have two different ways that you deal damage here. If you are dealing direct damage, say by shooting an enemy with a bullet, if you hit that enemy in one of these locations, it will deal damage based on what the location is you hit them at. However, if I were to throw a grenade, that grenade exploding near the enemy will deal damage based on their base type, which is featured under their name here. So almost all of the elites in the game are base type flak. Maulers, bombers, ragers, scab ragers rather, scab shotgunners, scab gunners. These are all flak armored types. Very common enemies, and this is why a lot of players you'll see are using flak armor on their weapons as one of their perks, because this is a very common type of damage, especially when you're looking at weapons like the flame staff, because it cannot hit directionally. Then you have the other group, which is unyielding base types. And then, of course, all of the bosses in the game, the major bosses, Plague Ogrins, Demon Host, Beast of Nurgle, not featured here, Chaos Spawn, because this is quite an old guide, as I mentioned. All of those enemies are going to take that additional damage from Unyielding. Now, I did want to make a little bit of a carve out when I talk about the bosses for a second, because when I'm talking about simplifying the damage calculations and simplifying weak spots and stuff like that for these enemies, I don't want that to apply to bosses. Bosses are large, they demand your entire attention, or at least a large share of it, and I believe that they should have this more detailed damage distributions, because also their parts are much larger. It makes more sense that you could pick and choose your hits to not, in fact, hit them in the hand, but instead hit them in the torso, and vice versa. That it makes sense that the Beast of Nurgle will have weak spots like the tongue, will have weak spots like the back shot spot. Those sort of things are really important to making it feel like you're being clever and outwitting the boss. But on individual enemies, they are far too detailed and nitty-gritty for what the system is intending to be. And all of this is to beat around the bush and to build up to my last point, which is that there is one enemy in this game that really stands out as egregious, and that is the Crusher. Crushers, like it or not, have come to define the meta in Darktide. They are oftentimes the true gatekeeper for higher difficulties, and players who are leveling and experiencing those higher difficulties will find out very quickly whether or not the weapons they have chosen are up to the task of taking out one of these guys. And the real unfortunate thing, and one of the worst things about Darktide's current balance, is that there are very few that actually can tackle this enemy. There are almost no range weapons that can do it, and there are just a few melee weapons that do it with any efficacy at all. And this is where one of the major distinctions is drawn between how Darktide has handled this issue versus Vermintide 2. Vermintide 2 had its own Crusher equivalent, as I mentioned previously, the Chaos Warrior, who also had the Carapace equivalent, which was called Super Armor. And those enemies were nigh invulnerable to most ranged attacks. Range was very, very ineffectual against them, but that meant you just needed to wade into combat against them and utilize your melee weapon to dispatch the enemy. And that was all well and good because it's seemingly by design, most melee weapons in that game had at least one, if not more, moves that were specifically tailored to penetrating armor, that would have greater efficacy against armor and therefore super armor. In addition, there was a much more simple path forward to stacking damage against these enemy types. We had not only just armored as one of the 4 base armor types in the game, but you could also put on damage versus chaos, since all chaos warriors were by necessity chaos typed, and therefore you could very easily tailor your build against such enemies. In Darktide, we don't exactly have that luxury. It should be a sign of some imbalance when one of the most popular choices for perks on weapons is Carapace armor, because these are the enemies that frag most lower players out when they start to climb those ranks. And that is because, yes, it still has that massive reduction in range damage. There are very, very few ranged weapons that can handle this, but as I said previously, there are not those melee options to counteract that, not in the way that Vermintide 2 had. In fact, there are many melee weapons in this game that were designed seemingly without any moves or any intention of tackling the armor threat at all, and that just simply cannot happen in a game that is now attempting to use Carapace armors like this to define difficulties. As the game tries to get more and more difficult and make itself more and more challenging, what we end up with is more Carapace armor in the fields, especially when we're considering something like rotten armor, and that makes more and more weapons have a bigger problem participating in any way, shape, or form. Compare the design of these enemies to the design of something like bosses. The reason I bring up bosses alongside Crushers here is because these two enemies are intending to function the same way for the enemy armies. What they're going to do to us is they're going to push us out of our offensive position and our posture and sort of scatter the team. They're going to break the team up and push them into a defensive posture. And that might push them off of a very defensible position. That might push them off of an objective or away from reviving your allies. Whatever it is, when these type of enemies show up on the battlefield, you have to get back and respect them until they're dealt with. And the two enemies do this in different ways. Crushers can physically threaten you by, if they are next to you, they'll drop an overhead on you and kill you, right? Bosses are able to physically bully you. Both Chaos Spawns and Plague Ogrins can actually shove you around the arena, and the Burgle can puke on you and eat you, or he can puke in the arena and make it so that walking in that area is going to necessitate you taking damage. So all of these enemies act as, sort of the line breakers. They come in, they walk through a bunch of damage and hellfire, and then they come in and they start pushing you out of position. And they both accomplish this, and I think that's great. Obviously, the way the Crusher does it is going to be much less interesting than the way the bosses do it, because he is kind of a glorified mini-boss in this sense. He is much more similar to a captain in his current design. And I think that's fine, because he's supposed to be an elite, not a boss. The problem is that the Crusher can be many times more difficult to dispatch than the boss is, depending on which weapons you choose. And my argument here would be that this is an unnecessary distinction, a distinction the game does not need to have. In combination with what I was saying earlier about all of this mixed armor typing and the further damage reduction that happens on limbs to enemies, this is another type of distinction that further polarizes the weapons and the tierings of weapons that already exist in the game and makes it into even more a case of haves and have-nots. So basically, I guess what I'm pushing for here is more equality and more parity. And believe me, I am not naive. I understand there is no such thing in Darktide nor in real life as true balance, as true equality, but it doesn't mean we can't continue pushing for better solutions that make it more equitable for more people, for more builds, for more abilities, for more weapons. And when I look at something like Carapace armor, I see a big middle finger fuck you to a massive, massive swath of the game that could very easily be done some other way that doesn't have that effect, right? It is an entirely brutal shutting out of a big, big swath of this game's options. And so here is what I want to suggest as an alternative, as a way to make Carapace armor, or at least the Crushers, who are really the multiplying factor for this, less of a problem for the game. Give Crushers a flak armored head. Or give them a flak armored body part, like a chest or something like that, right? Or a flak armored back. They need to have a weakness. Right now, being completely cloaked in Carapace armor, they are just absolutely impenetrable by weapons, as I've talked about so far. There's a good portion of weapons that just simply cannot against these guys. What you're intending to create here is an enemy who threatens you, that forces you to actually engage with them for some amount of time before you can dispatch them, because they have a lot of health and they resist your damage, right? But you've got that already. That's called the Bulwark. The Bulwark is literally just this. He has a shield that is just a increased version of Carapace armor. The shield takes literally 0 damage. So when this guy has his shield up, you can't hurt him at all. But if you wait around and let him get an attack or two in, and you dodge him effectively, or you can stagger him or CC him in some way, shape, or form, you can kill him because now you can hit his soft underbelly, which is all unyielding. And that is the design that the Crusher should have. They want to break your lines. They want to force you to react to them being there and respect their space. Bulwarks already do that, although they're not very threatening at it. Crushers could do that and still retain a counter. And so what can we do with Crushers? Well, Crushers, if they are given a flak armor weak spot, you still need to evade them. You still need to outmaneuver them so that you get a chance to hit on that weak spot quite a bit. And of course, they have a very high health pool in comparison, so they're going to take a lot longer to dispatch. In addition to this, they should keep that base armor type of Carapace. I think I mentioned this earlier, but in case you didn't catch it, the base armor type of these enemies defines what effects explosions and damage over time has on them. And you know what's already good enough in this game? Explosions and damage over time, right? We don't need burns and bleeds to be killing Crushers as fast as they do Bulwarks. So leave them with that Carapace armor base type so that they are highly resilient to burns and bleeds and all that sorts of stuff, and it requires more precision and requires more finesse to dispatch them in some actual counterable way, encouraging you to hit weak spots or encouraging you to dodge behind them and hit the back of their plate. Maybe we could even sort of explore the idea of enemies having armor that is damageable in stages, such that if the Carapace armor takes X amount of damage, he loses it in that region and then can be damaged. I know that they've had systems like that in the past because there were simply shields on the storm vermin in Vermintide 2 that could be broken in stages, and then you could hit the storm vermin much more easily. So we can do this, right? This is an accomplishable goal within the network of the game, and I think this would reduce the necessity of bringing a Carapace countering weapon, of bringing a Crusher countering weapon, because now you could simply rely on your own skill to dispatch this enemy by hitting him in the head or hitting the weak spot or whatever it is. So there you go. Asked and answered. That is a really simple solution. I would love to see some attention put into these sort of enemies this year because we have gone a very long time with these enemies retaining very basic movesets and being annoying in the same old ways. And the increased Crusher health last year was kind of an affront to God, honestly, and has made things even worse for many, many weapons and players out there. So I would love to see something like this added as an additional skill encouraging factor, and I think it would go a long way toward providing for more equitable systems, both in Darktide and in real life. And I'm all about that shit. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you have a really good one. Stay safe out there. Mystery out. Bye.